Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. And for those of you that listen regularly, we took a bit of a hiatus over the holidays, combination of ending the semester and beginning the new one and the holidays and, various factors. So we've been out of the loop for a while, but we're now back in the saddle here at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined today by two guests. Professor Darren Shaw, who has slotted us in between classes today on what is the fourth class day of the semester? Is that where we are? We started Monday?
That's right. Tuesday, Thursday.
Your big days, baby.
11 o'clock to 12:30, 2 to 3:30. That's me.
And here he is, just still popping, right, in between classes.
That's right. Fresh off my appearance at Jerry World, where I saw 1 yard, Jim and Josh, 1 yard, and we'd have been in the championship game.
Well,
I'm still hurting.
I'm glad that you're here and you have lots of work to do to salve those wounds.
Yeah.
Lots of teaching work. And, of course, Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Josh, welcome back.
Hey, I was going to say out of the studio, but never out of the loop.
Yeah, it's not like we haven't been talking.
Hey,
welcome back,
We
Josh.
just took a little break.
We took a little break.
Because otherwise there would be no break.
and I think one of the things, hopefully, that we'll illustrate today is that, we weren't doing nothing. To that point, today, the agenda is to talk over highlights of the University of Texas Politics Project poll that we conducted in mid-December. Now, that raises a couple of questions for at least some of you. Some of you, I probably overthink this, but I was referring to this as kind of old, and my wife was like, it's not old.
Well, no, it's funny. I mean, you're saying that. I just looked at my watch to look, it's the 16th. I was like, you know what? I mean, we were in the field less than a month ago.
Yeah.
So it's not really, it just feels old.
Right.
We like to get it out as quickly as possible.
As we'll talk about, the poll was in the field from the 9th to the 17th. We didn't get to the data till the 19th or the 20th, which is still pretty fast turnaround, but nonetheless.
We're not going to release it on Christmas.
We weren't going to release it on, the Friday before Christmas. That just seemed silly. And so here we are. Now, for our regular listeners, I should say, obviously the timing is a little odd. We're going to talk about the poll. We're going to probably focus mostly on national stuff. Timing's a little odd given that the big percolating story in Texas politics since the election, and that is the selection of Dustin Burrows as the new Speaker of the Texas House, just happened yesterday as we're recording this it took place Tuesday, 2 days ago, as we're recording this Thursday morning. There's going to be plenty of time to kick this around as the session unfolds. We may even touch on it as things unfold here in terms of, I suspect, talking about Republican coalitional politics at both the national and the state level.
About wasting a question on Phelan in the poll.
Right. Yeah, there you go. The next big foreseeable event on that front is the debate over House rules next week. And I would just, take host privilege and say there's still a lot percolating in the House. It doesn't seem like we have a speaker, but, it's like people are putting on their back Mike shoes, I think, for the coming session. And those of you who follow the legislature know what I mean. So we'll be back to talk about this to the extent that we don't really air it out completely this week. And we'll probably know more by the time we do next week's podcast. So with that all there, today, let's start, I think, guys, by talking about what the December poll found when it comes to the big shift in national politics. We have a battery of questions, I think, that in many ways were one of the hearts of this poll, at least at the national level. And these were questions about potential priorities of the new Republican-led government in Washington. So, Josh, why don't you set us up for that, talk about the structure of the questions and the top-line results we got, the basics.
Sure. So we did this with two overall questions. One's a battery and then one's a follow-up. So the battery asked, how much priority should the Trump administration put on developing policies and plans to try to, and then there were 11 different sort of policy areas, and they range. And I may as well say what they are because there's a little bit of art to this. So lower the prices of goods and services, deport immigrants who are in the U.S. illegally, cut taxes for large businesses, cut taxes for individual taxpayers, increase tariffs on imported goods, end government diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, limit U.S. aid to foreign allies, reduce the size of the federal government, strengthen national defense, and reduce the flow of fentanyl into the country. Overall, respondents had a choice of saying it should be a very high priority, a medium priority, a low priority, or not a priority. And partially that scale is big, so we can get some variance and really, in some ways, force people to at least tell us what they really think matters. And then we followed that up and we said, well, okay, of all these, what should be the top priority? And that allows us to both get a sense of what is sort of the rank order first priority, but also we can see them in comparison to each other. Overall, unsurprisingly, given all the polling we've done, lowering the prices of goods and services was the only item that's received a majority of Texas voters saying this should be a very high priority of the Trump administration, so 54%. Notably, increasing tariffs on imported goods, 12% said that should be a very high priority. 11% said it should be a very high priority to cut taxes for large businesses. Huge differences here, obviously, by partisanship. Unsurprisingly, most of these policies are much more attractive to Republicans than to Democrats. Only lowering the prices of goods and services saw a majority of Democrats saying this should be a very high priority. Whereas for Republicans, there were 4 issues where a majority of Texas Republican voters said that should be a very high priority of the administration. The number one was reducing the flow of fentanyl into the country, 60%, so that should be a very high priority. About the same, strengthening the national defense, 59%, lowering prices, 56%, and deporting immigrants who are in the U.S. illegally, 55%, so about the same as lowering prices. When we asked what is the number one issue that they should focus on, for all voters, the plurality, 34% said lowering the prices of goods and services. About 1 in 5, 19% said deporting immigrants who are in the U.S. illegally, with 1 in 10 saying cut taxes for individual taxpayers. For Democrats, lowering prices was clearly the number one priority, 45%, followed at a pretty distant second by cutting taxes for individual taxpayers at 17%, which is interesting and notable in some ways. We can come back to that. Republicans were split. The plurality said they think that the Trump administration should focus on deporting undocumented immigrants, 32%, with 25% saying they should focus on lowering prices. So 57% of Republican voters in total said that should be, those two things should be the top priorities, whereas most of the other things were around 10% or significantly less.
So what do you make of this there? And there was something I was going to flag on this, but I've lost the thought. But so what do you make of this, Darren? I mean, I'm specifically interested. I mean, as we were to pull back the curtain in our internal discussions, you, I think, very productively, reminded that we needed to put the reducing spending items that are in this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, kind of what you made of the results.
Well, I think if I'm looking at this from the perspective of the Trump administration, there's 4 obvious choices for emphasis. Lowering prices of goods and services, strengthening national defense, cutting taxes for taxpayers, individual taxpayers, and then reducing the flow of fentanyl. The 5th is immigration, which I think is almost equally obvious, but with an asterisk or with a caveat. And when I say obvious, Josh mentioned these, very high priority ratings. If you combine high and very high, the top 4 items, 71% or above identify them as a high priority or a very high priority. So that's, getting prices under control, reducing fentanyl, strengthening defense, cutting taxes. Those 4 things have at least 70% support. The next highest rating is when you move to immigration, goes to 56% or 53%, I think. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge gap between those 4 and everything else. And it's manifest in the next question we said, which is all right. We've asked about all these things. What are the top priorities? And you get prices, deporting immigrants here illegally, cutting taxes, strengthening national defense. 4 things. Now, the fentanyl is, on that top priority list is a little lower, but, so there's 4 or 5 things. The immigration thing looks a little trickier because when you start talking about deporting people who are here illegally, the way we framed it, which I think is right, but just so everybody knows, we say deport immigrants who are in the United States illegally. We didn't say illegal immigrants who are here illegally. And that's where you begin to get a small clutch of voters, especially Democrats, who are opposed to that. Now, if you frame that deporting, as the Trump administration said it's going to do, people who have already been denied asylum claims or who have been charged with a crime here in the United States. My sense is, now that's not a priority, that's a policy question, but in terms of a priority, I think that would ratchet it up quite a bit. So I look at this and I'm thinking, if you're talking about tariffs or if you're talking about, cuts to business, corporate tax cuts, limiting foreign aid, people don't care.
Yeah.
You got a pretty obvious agenda that you need to pursue. And I would actually be fairly optimistic if I were in the Trump administration looking across it. I think you can cut deals on most of these items, which gets to one thing to say people want something done. The other is, can you actually do it? The trickiest one, of course, is actually getting prices under control.
Well, that's what I wanted to follow up on because, and I confused two different questions here in terms of what, the discussion that you sort of inserted the debt stuff on. But this leads to that. And we don't have to, we can come back to this list, but if you look at the economic components in the question about, where concerns are in the economy, I think it underlines how difficult it is to actually attack that price thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. People want to spend money to solve problems.
Yes.
And so what the impulse here would be is to say, like, okay, well, you need to pump more money into the economy to address certain problems, except
really drives prices up.
That's
when
a
you
problem.
Do that.
Yeah, and it's the same with tariffs, obviously, too, which is a couple of things you've committed to are probably going to be inflationary. And, I don't even know what, the president has, as we all know, a relatively limited toolkit when it comes to dealing with inflation. This is a problem that goes back to Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
What do you do? You're dependent on the Fed, and even the Fed has limited tools, and the Fed is obviously insulated from the president with respect to, what the Fed is going to do. The president can only sort of suggest and then hope the Fed takes their advice.
Or complain.
Yeah, or complain. So, while I'm convinced that the sort of pathway is obvious, the execution of that pathway, especially on the prices, is really going to be tricky. And especially as Jim, you pointed out, that there are some contradictory impulses here, right? The public wants you to spend money on some things, but that could exacerbate inflation.
Well, and some of them are
and the deficit, which is
they're contradictory within Trump's own kind of program, and as we're seeing as the Congress shapes up, particularly the U.S. House. Not everybody shares the president's theory of economics, right, including some prominent people from Texas.
Yeah, I think this is all really, what's really interesting about this data is I'm saying, again, before we were talking about this, and in some sense, there's ways to read this data and kind of just see what you want, depending on, again, how you want to interpret this. And I think there's a certain sense that if you kind of look at the top lines with a quick glance, I think it's easy to look at the Trump administration and also Republicans in Texas and think, boy, you've got a pretty hefty meal on your plate, right? In the sense of like, if you look at what people say that they're worried about here, and it's like, the mixture of delivering on prices, on housing, on, sort of increasing concerns and dissatisfaction with healthcare, which is kind of floating around out there, while also, potentially deporting, millions and millions of people. It's like, well, you're right. Like, I agree with Darren. Like, on the one hand, it's sort of straightforward in that there's clearly areas of some consensus. And you can see, what's interesting in some of this data, going back to the priority piece, for instance, just looking at, for Democrats, for instance, on deporting immigrants who are in the U.S. illegal, if you're looking at kind of what's gone on in the last couple of weeks in the Congress, 45% of Democrats said that was a low priority or not a priority. 6% didn't know. That's 51 total. What does that mean? 49% of Democrats said that deporting undocumented immigrants should be a medium priority, a high priority, or a very high priority.
Right.
And so there's a little bit of a trickiness here, and I think that also applies, though, on the other side. I think it's really easy to look and say, well, if Trump just follows through on a couple things, but when you look at those concerns about the economy piece, what's notable, and again, Darren, very rightly included the national debt and the federal budget deficit on this sort of large battery of potential economic concerns. But when we look at the share of Republicans who are very concerned about each, and you look at the federal budget deficit, the national debt, the cost of housing, and the price of gasoline, they're statistically indistinguishable from each other when you talk about the share of Republicans who are very concerned about it.
Yeah.
And what that, it says to me, it's like, the point's like, well, can we just throw money at it? Well, not if we're concerned about the debt and the deficit. So that's off the table, right? And so part of it is figuring out, even in the sense, people want things, and usually things cost money. But there's also that clear concern about the underlying, financial standing of the country. And it's equally there with these things that everyone is talking about. Like, oh, it's got to be, you got to do something about housing. It's like, well, is it going to increase the budget deficit? Is it going to increase the debt? Because that's going to create a lot of problems to getting to a deal.
You're right. I think, just not to veer too far off into policy, and particularly economic policy, but, the panacea for all these things is according to the Trump people, is regulation. Mm-hmm. Like they see this as a supply issue, whether it's housing, whether it's labor, it's a supply issue, and the supply is strangled by regulation. Mm-hmm. I don't mean to say that with an eye roll. I think there's some truth to that.
That's the argument.
Right. That's the argument.
I think you could probably find that phrase without looking too hard from a Trump nominee.
Right. And that's you talk about a heavy meal. I would, let's keep with the heavy thing. That's a heavy lift you're putting on deregulation, right? To increase basically the, incentive structure and the opportunity for increases in supply, which presumably will bring down prices and increase, and we'll see. We'll see. It's there's a theory of the case.
There's a reason some of these. Again, not to get into some kind of policy discussion, but it's an interesting test of abstract theories when you look at the underlying tensions in these responses, which are kind of remarkable in the degree to which they track with what the administration is talking about.
Yeah. I tell you that in addition to regulation, though, there is, what we do is we talk about voter psychology, and we emphasize voter psychology, but this is, sort of Americans or Texans psychology too. And the question that's really interesting is there going to be, the evaluations in a lot of sense have been frozen for a while because each side has said like, well, I can't tell you how I think the future is going to go because I don't know who's going to win.
Yeah.
Well, we have a winner now. And so what's interesting in the data, which we can talk about, is that one side has been freed up, their unbridled optimism is kind of showing here. And while we could talk about partisan polarization and the differences, but if, 60% of the country, Republicans and some independents and some Democrats think things are good and they think the economy is going to be good, there's a little potential for self-fulfilling prophecy here. And I'll be interested. So there's sort of regulation plus consumer confidence that
I'm
Trump's banking heavily on.
I totally agree with you on a lot of that because I think there is. Again, we see too much in the data. Sort of the way that we're already starting to see it. We haven't seen it just yet, but I think once we do our next poll in February, and certainly by April, you're going to see the economic evaluation numbers have flipped by party. So it's sort of easy to kind of say, well, what do we do with this, right? But the other part of it, I think that that you raise that I think is interesting about all this is sort of twofold. Is one, I think that the challenge here is because it's prices and not jobs. It's not just a supply thing. And and you talk to people, and I think you talk to Democrats sort of as sour grapes after the election, trying to sort of quote unquote figure out what happened. And I was having a conversation with a Democrat of relative prominence, I guess, I don't know, not too long ago. And we're talking about prices and. This person said to me, well, and I've heard this from a lot of Democrats, like, well, when are people going to get used to higher prices? And it's like, how about when their incomes go up? Or the prices come, if they're not, and it's sort of like Democrats are still trying to figure this out. So just to say that is just to make the point that I do think it's possible that, we're going to see a big shift in, sort of economic sentiment now that, putting this quote together, the long national nightmare of the Biden administration is over and the strangling of the economy and all the things that he must have done to ruin people's lives. At the same time, if gas prices are still high, if grocery prices are still high, what are you going to tell people? And I think there's a little bit of that, kind of all throughout the poll. And you see this in a lot of politics. You see this with the tariffs too, which is you can't really it's an old phrase, but you piss on someone and tell them it's raining. It's but people didn't really vote for tariffs. That's what the data tells you. So if that's the thing you want to implement on day one, it's that's a decision that's being made, but it's not what people are talking about. They're talking about these things. And I wonder how much a shift in the administration is really going to push people if they really do feel like prices are too high, or they do really feel like they don't have economic opportunity.
Yeah. In some sense, the limited toolkit of the president to actually affect the economy might actually help the president here. In other words,
he's already walking away from prices.
Trump will do some different things. Elections have consequences, as everybody keeps saying. But fighting inflation is tough. However, I do think, and this is sort of a naive perspective probably, but I do think, consumer psychology really matters. And if people just think Trump is better at managing and the economy is going to be better, the investment and the growth sort of occurs irrespective of specific policies that are being proposed. And I'm not saying that economics is solely about psychology and not about policy, but I do think sometimes we overrate the toolkit of the president. And I sometimes think we underrate psychology. And this, by the way, the outgoing administration, I think, would probably agree with some of this, that there's this irrational pessimism about the American economy.
Well, there's a degree of motivated reasoning in some of this, I think, from a partisan perspective.
Right.
When you're
Although Democrats also have pretty...
Well, right. I mean, I'm going to come to you in a second, Josh.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the interesting things about like this conversation we're having, and this is, kind of a simple point, but I kind of want to make it just from 30,000 feet, the idea that when I look at all these, that these were the two buckets of results we're talking about, I'm pretty struck. Maybe I've done too many talks recently, as I know both of you have, about, is polling broken or not or whatever. But, how familiar this all is and how much continuity these attitudes show from what we saw in the election environment and in the outcome of the election. It doesn't get the Trump administration off the hook for having to perform, but what that performance looks like, I think, is, he's, they are as at the mercy of conditions as the Biden administration was and as the first Trump administration was.
Yeah. And I would say, I agree with what you're saying. I think the one caveat I would make is, it's not even so much like, voter psychology or consumer psychology, but where you do see a difference probably is in the psychology and the approach of CEOs. And that's been going on all over the place right now. So if the sense is that, Washington is more, open, there's going to be less oversight. There's going to be more openness to more, more approaches to the economy that are beneficial. Then they're going to invest more. They're going to do more stuff. Like that makes sense. And that could accrue, benefit to workers. But the thing is, people aren't saying they're worried about finding jobs, right?
Right.
They're still worried about prices. And part of that also is like some of that also has to do with international supply chains, all this other stuff. And I think, this just comes down to the fact is what we'll be doing always. And this was sort of the first Trump administration question was, is there a point at which this matters? We saw inflation ticking up a little bit, in terms of the last numbers. If prices don't start to come down, if we don't see good economic numbers, and one thing that people don't care about is how the stock market is doing. So outside of the stock market going up, which is that sort of future sense, right? And again, in terms of the people who have a sense that we're saying right now, okay, what do I think is going to happen? Yeah, there's optimism because of these ideas that, again, maybe the government takes its hands off the wheel a little bit more, and that all makes sense. I think that's all very reasonable. But does that apply to the normal voters who I think, probably affected the margins in the way they did in the last election?
Well, I think, Darren, you really put your finger on something interesting to me that I think, really is the core of how is this going to shake out, right? And that is, something that we are very familiar with from the polling, from what we've seen in politics, is that up to a point, there's a pretty significant degree to which people's predispositions, their psychology, their partisanship inflects their views of the economy. Right. Now, that we saw the limit case of that for Biden, right? Yeah. With Biden. What is that going to look like here? I mean, look, we've spent the last 2 years talking about the price of eggs, and the price of eggs still pretty high. Somebody went and bought some eggs the other day, and I didn't really notice that much, but there's been so much I was like, people are right. Yeah. These, $6 for this package of eggs is a little much.
Was it on Morning Joe where Joe Scarborough was saying, like, people are mad because it's like $4 for butter, and Mika Brzezinski says it's $8, and he turns to her. I actually think this was a genuine moment. He turns to her and goes, $8? What are they made of gold? And it was really revealing because
Mika probably buys that fancy Irish butter.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. But it was such that little exchange was so interesting because he meant to make a point about almost to kind of minimize the Americans being soft and come on, $4. But then when he was actually kind of
he had the same response everyone else
is. Every American consumer has.
And that price of eggs is twice what it was a year ago.
Yeah, right.
So,
right.
And that is, still, and the sensitivity of that is present throughout
the poll.
Every time we ask people about the economy in this poll and they have a chance to differentiate,
Yeah.
prices are huge.
And, it's there was a nice analysis done by a Democratic consultant that kind of made its way into the hands of the media and had a nice little run in October, kind of trotting out Democratic ideas or messaging on the economy. And I remember the macro heading was, you deluded ungrateful wretches.
Right. And
it was the point of the chart, I remember, was to say that, this probably isn't great messaging.
Right.
But, comic kind of, chops aside, that sort of was the Democratic messaging. And in fact, even in Biden's farewell address, there was this sort of, and obviously there are data that support that interpretation. And there's classic, our economy is the envy of the world,
right.
Which I think intellectually we all understand. But
what good does that do me when I'm in the grocery line?
Exactly. I do. I just recoil at, the take on politics and the take on the election, that minimized, the legitimacy of that reaction. Because, we've talked about this in many instances, telling the public they're dumb for having the reaction they have is never, first of all, it's usually wrong.
Or that they're
and it's
wrong,
always wrong
or that they're wrong
politically.
in believing what they believe.
Right.
So but that, that places us right where I started, right, which is that's going to apply to Donald Trump too, I think. Even Donald Trump is singular and idiosyncratic and all these other things about him.
Yeah. And Jim, I apologize.
wonder.
Yeah, I apologize earlier because I was focusing on and sort of took the conversation the wrong direction in some ways on the big macros, the most important, the top priorities. But Josh was referring and Jim was sort of teeing this up for a more particular reaction to the economic priorities. And I do think that's, those data in here are really pretty fascinating. And the partisan divide, there's a consensus that, even Democrats think, inflation, prices are a big deal. But when you start breaking it down beyond that, you really do see interesting partisan differences. Right. And as Jim, as you were pointing out, Republicans want a lot of different, almost contradictory things. And then Democrats want other things within this basket of the economy. So, as Josh was pointing out, we talked about the cost of healthcare, housing, gasoline, the debt, the deficit. And, you really see, first of all, most everything matters, or we're concerned about most everything, but variation is really coincident with party. Democrats are concerned. But by the way, you see some of these, potential advantages for the Democrats in these smaller bore ideas. So, like the cost of healthcare, the cost of housing. If these rise to the fore, Jim, to your point, if prices, even if prices sort of stay where they are, but if these other things become acute, and I can't help but thinking about, Jim and I have ties to Los Angeles, and think about the wildfires. And, I've had family try to find apartment space in Los Angeles even 5 years ago, and it was almost impossible. I can't imagine what it's going to be like now. And that's an acute example, but look at Austin and look at the price of housing in Austin. I could see these other issues being kind of the new frontier and a place where if Trump isn't on top of these things, and if they rise to the fore, he's just going to have the same kind of broad economic issues Biden did, just under a different.
And that's what I wonder, right? Yeah. These are.
They're big systemic issues. When you look at this list, one of the interesting things, I think, there's two things I'll just draw from this, which is to say, most of the inflation over the last, really any period of time you pick it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. So even going beyond the sort of recent period is driven primarily by housing, healthcare, and education. If you look at consumer goods have actually been relatively steady for a long period of time until this recent uptick, which is sort of what people are noticing. But I also would point out that people are also noticing because if your rent goes up $300 a month, then the available funds to spend on this other stuff that's now also significantly more expensive is also very much less. I'd also add, just to throw it out there, cost of housing also includes insurance, which is becoming almost nearly impossible, speaking of LA. And places like Austin, too. There's sort of a standing kind of cliff out there. I'm sorry, I lost my train.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's okay.
Look, I think we've sort of arrived at, to me, that's the looming question. Yeah. Right? That is highlighted by what we see in the data, right? That there are these underlying tensions in the agenda, and we have a lot of We know that this did not work out very well for the last guy.
I remember. Can I come in for tensions
sure.
of the agenda?
The train is back.
Yeah, the train is back. No, I was thinking, all this talk about, is it inflation or is it prices? And in some ways it doesn't matter because of how voters don't really respond to it differently. But from a policy standpoint, it is kind of different, right? We know that inflation is relatively cool, but if inflation is the problem, in some ways the goal is to pull the government back and pull it out of it. Right? That is, we want less investment. We don't want to start sending checks out to everybody. We don't want huge tax cuts because we don't want to increase inflation. If the problem is prices and cost of living, that might point to a different set of solutions that might require more government to do something, whether regulatory or otherwise, to address those prices. The issue here right now is that, when you tie those things together with the concern about the debt and the deficit, it really ties the hands, I think, of whoever's in power right now, because the idea is people want you to do something. They don't want you to drive inflation. And also the ruling party doesn't want to see you increase the debt or deficit. So what can you actually do? And then you're left with let's shrink the size of government. We've got, and everybody talks about, fraud, waste, abuse, and how much is that going to really accrue to actual savings? And it's usually very little.
I think Musk and Ramaswamy are already coming off some of their initial estimates about what Doge might accomplish.
Because they were going to have to.
Yeah.
I think ridiculous.
I think that's it was almost always going to be the case. It's just an administration coming in or a lead session, firing things up in Austin. There's always questions about what to tackle. I was struck, though, to return to my original point, that at the national level, the American public's pretty clear. And I think the election was pretty clear on what they want Trump to do. But as we were saying, the inflation part is the trickiest part of it. I do think there's the potential for a deal on some things. I'm interested in, at the national level, Fetterman and Warren and others basically signaling to Trump that if you want a bipartisan deal, so just for instance, this is I have no inside knowledge, but this is speculation. Take the tax cuts, which are set to expire this next year. The tax cuts, the tax rates were cut in 2017, right? 2017, for every level except I think it was $200,000 to $600,000. That rate stayed the same. What if you just said, okay, let's renew everything except the $600,000 and up tax rate, which I think went from 39% to 37% or something like that, right?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly, but something like that.
Could you get a deal by basically saying okay, we're going to renew the tax cuts except not for the rich?
Yeah.
Which actually would, one, have bipartisan support, I'll bet, and two, would kind of address the revenue issue, right? Because the tax cuts are in place, right? So what you're talking about then is actually recouping. In other words, I think this sort of populism of Trump's appeal could create opportunities for unique solutions. But that's, again, if he's looking for them. And
that was my main question for you. I think the thing that I kind of come to, going into the second term is, how willing is Trump to make a deal? Yeah. I think that's sort of been the interesting thing about this whole deal maker persona and everything else, because I haven't seen many deals.
Well, and with who, and who's ready to make a deal, particularly in the House.
I would say, even if you make a deal in the Senate.
Well, it's ironic that, and we know from the literature on the presidency that, presidents tend to gravitate towards foreign policy late in their terms, or certainly in their second terms, because they have more latitude, because they can make deals, and because domestic politics is less pressing when it comes to that. So I'm kind of interested in the potential for, deals in the Middle East, continuation of things like the Abrams Accords, the potential for a deal in Ukraine, et cetera. These are really kind of interesting. Domestically, it will be tricky. I do think one thing that's clear in the data is, and this will be an interesting test of, the Trump personality. What there's no appetite for is pursuing political vendettas and lawfare and, people, even Republicans. So it's interesting. I had this conversation with a friend of mine here at UT who's extremely concerned about Trump sort of pressing these things against Liz Cheney and other people. And his point was that, well, you have to pay off your constituents who want scalps. I don't think that's necessary at all. Now, if he wants to do that, that's a reflection of his personality, I think. But the data suggests that you know what Republicans aren't saying is a high priority? Going after Liz Cheney or Jack Smith, or it's just not in the data. Mm-hmm. The priorities here, again, circling way back, are pretty obvious. Help me with help me on affordability, control the southern border, relatedly stop the fentanyl spread. And interestingly, we might want to talk about this later. This might be one of my sort of bullet points at the end. Strengthen national defense.
Yeah.
Even
Which
the
is a very odd. I thought that was an odd response given some of the other responses.
I'm
in the
glad
poll.
we put it in, and I think Josh might have, or you, Jim, might have insisted on it. But I think it's a sleeper issue if the administration is actually looking to build a record of accomplishment. Because I do think there's real potential for bipartisan. There is obviously an isolationist sentiment of don't commit American treasure resources, but there's also part of that mentality is we're spread too thin. We need to have we need to have what's Haig says phrase, a lethal fighting force.
You can be
Democrats don't want to look soft.
You can and
Yes.
and as a Republican, I mean, you can be pro national defense but not interventionist.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And there's a certain
I think that's a way. We're talking about
traditional nationalism in the Republican Party that has looked like that over time.
Yeah, I guess what we're sort of searching for here is
And those are your spoils, right?
Yeah.
In the spoil,
Right.
instead of scalps, those are the spoils, right? I mean, how do you want to send a bunch of economic aid to a bunch of different, either both high level, low, mid, and just spread it out?
Yeah.
Increase the fighting force.
Yeah, and I think we're looking at, and all of us here, in this room certainly, but more broadly, are trying to figure out what is this coalition, what is this new Republican Party about? And so I look at the data that we're bringing and trying to find areas where you might be able to, square this circle or.
Well, for once you mentioned populism before I did, but when you raised it, I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things that is just bubbling under here. Like,
oh yeah,
what is this contemporary form of populism that now has a home in the Republican Party?
Yeah, I think it's the question.
I
wonder
and how does it coexist with traditional Republican priorities? And that's why I was talking about deficits, your inclusion of deficits and the debt, because there are obviously still elected officials at the elite or cadre level that are still obviously, we're sitting here in Texas. Chip Roy's not going to let that go.
Right.
At least not for free.
Yeah. I think, there's still, it's interesting. We'll get to these numbers probably here in just a minute, but there's this increase in evaluations favorability of some institutions as well as some, elites. And some of that is that, we have the resolution of the election. So Republicans are more likely to say we're favorable towards institutions that are now going to be clearly under Republican control. Mm-hmm. So that's a big part of it. But there's an interesting question, right? Which is Trump comes to power as consistent with, the appeal of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and others criticizing the system. But Warren's quote the other day, Senator Warren's quote was, if, Trump wants my help to unrig the system, I'm there for him.
Yeah.
Right?
If he really means it.
Right. If he means it.
From my point of view.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is interesting, right? That now you are in charge of the entity that has attracted all this antipathy. And, DOGE is sort of an interesting, we kind of laughed a little bit, but it's a serious, how do you govern when you're, to the extent you have a mandate, it's to, reform governance.
So, I want to pivot from this before we get to the end. We got to get you to class on time. So, I want to talk for just a second. A question for both of you, but because you're not always here, Darren. But or for all of us, really, I want to look at the priority items. We asked an open-ended question asking our respondents what they thought the legislature's top priority should be. Why don't you tell us what we got from that? And I just want to preface this. The reason I want to pivot hard to this is that this is one of the areas where I thought the prevalence of the issues that define the national election, not surprisingly, have really carried through even when we point respondents to the legislature to some degree.
Yeah. So we asked them an open-ended question. What's sort of the one priority that you think the legislature should definitely be focused on here in 2025? So obviously, no one issue dominates when people can say anything, but the issue that came up most frequently, unsurprisingly, was immigration and the border, which is 22% of all voters, but 37% of Republican voters, which was clearly the plurality. So 22% of voters said immigration or the border, 16% said the economy or prices, and 8% said something about public education as sort of the three biggest issues. For Democrats, it was the economy and prices, 18%, public education at 11%. And to be clear, they're open-ended. That was not pro-voucher comments. Those were very clearly, and
that was a little less than 1%, and about 2% of Republicans.
About 2% of Republicans mentioned vouchers. in a positive way. And then for Republicans, 37% said immigration at the border, which should not surprise us at all, or anyone who's listened to this podcast. 14% said the economy or prices. And then there was a pretty big spread after that across other things, which again points to this fact that these driving issues are still the driving issues.
Right. And then to our previous point about the mood for spending and what is going on, when we ask people about state spending in a question, these are not completely unfamiliar responses, but they were interesting in terms of what the top 3 or 4 items were in which people said the state was still spending too little.
Right. So overall, I think we have about 12 different policy areas where the state was spending too much, about the right amount, or too little. Only 3 areas saw a majority of voters saying the state spends too little. That was mental health services, 58%, healthcare, 55%, same area. And then electric infrastructure is still a sore spot, 50%, very close to majority, 49% each, K through 12 public education, and children in the state's care. But it's important to note here that only one issue saw a majority of Republicans saying the state was spending too little, and that was border security. Mental health services was 49%, electric infrastructure was 45%, healthcare 42%, and everything else was below 40% of Republicans saying the state was spending too little. Remember, this is the majority party's voters. And so even though, this sort of clear concern about both, let's set the border aside, but clear concern about the economy is everywhere in the poll, it's not as though you see Texas Republican voters, majority party voters, looking at the government and saying, hey, you guys need to start investing in this stuff, or hey, we need more in, really any number of areas except for border security, where you see consistent and continued support for increased spending.
But electric infrastructure was pretty high.
Electric infrastructure remains high.
Yeah. Well, I thought, the top item was mental health services. And I can't help but wonder if the school shootings.
It was the top item last time.
Yeah, but I don't mean that.
I completely agree with that.
I think this is, I wonder if it's, Uncle Joe, is struggling with, his situation. That's something that Texans think we ought, or it's younger people, vulnerable populations, and the potential for violence. Yeah, I really believe it's.
Well, and look, if you go back to the aftermath of some of the school shootings, we've seen a lot of kind of consensus movement in public opinion when you ask people about either causes or remedies.
Yeah.
Mental health is the safe harbor to avoid the imbroglio of talking about guns.
I'd also say that mental health has come up in other domains now, too. So it's also school shootings, but it gets talked about a lot in terms of homelessness.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that homelessness and veterans and suicide. And so there's just, I think that the issue of mental health has become one that comes up in a bunch of different policy domains. And it's very easy for people to say, like, I say from other polling that I've done, I want to say maybe the Lyceum polling we've done, we ask people about access. There's really major uneven distribution of access to mental health services depending on whether you live in urban, suburban, or rural communities, your education level. So I think all that stuff is really, just become, it's easy to say we should be doing more.
And I think it's, my standard caveat to this question is, people tend to want to spend money to solve problems. So there's a little bit of, and
there's an inflationary force in this question.
Because saying I want to spend more money is a marker for I think this is a serious problem. Mm-hmm. However, even in other contexts, we didn't do this here, but in other contexts, we'll ask, like, even if would you like to spend more or less or about the same, even if it means higher taxes, and you still get very high percentages saying I still think we should be spending more on this issue. So I just wanted people who are looking at the results should know that this isn't, people's willingness to say they want to spend more money is not simply a function of, kind of the inflated tendency
being
to
profligate.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Or just to show how much you care about the issue. It's even with provisos, people say, like, no, we should spend more money. I also think the variance across the issues really is interesting. The distinction between K through 12 versus higher ed is important. You also see on the too much side, whenever there's sort of a partisan divide, if the issue is a little bit partisan, that's where you'll see the too much number popping up. So 17% say there's too much spending on border security, 15% too much spending on environmental protection, 19% too much on prisons and the penal system. So that's a
Well,
marker.
and the flip side, of the 12 issues we tested, in 8 of them, a majority of Democrats said the state was spending too little.
Yeah.
And so some of that is realistic, and some of that is also just, disappointment. And I think the healthcare numbers being at the top, and again, it is partially the school shootings. It's also the fact that, Texas remains, the state with the highest share of uninsured adults in the country. It's twice, I think, the national average. So, it's just likely, given that 1 in 5 Texans probably doesn't have health insurance.
There are some cartons of eggs. There's some cartons of eggs.
Yeah,
in
it's just out there. Just like the border, just like the border being right there, kind of affects the salience of the issue.
The reason I kind of pivoted that way, because to me, it remains interesting the degree to which you see the combination here of the national political environment in the concerns, immigration, economy, prices. And then the issues that we think of as really have been active, whether because of public or elite concerns, one can debate that. Public education drops down to 8. The spending on K through 12 education, as you pointed out, Josh, 49% too little, 29% right amount, 10% too much. That's a much more homegrown issue in terms of the dynamics in the state right now. And it's interesting to me to watch, what is bubbling up and what is emanating down, right? And how those two are colliding at the state level as we go into the session. And, you were pointing this out as we were doing the write-up yesterday, Josh, where, the state has some money to spend, but we're not as flush as we look given what the demands are. Mm-hmm. And we still see a lot of, pretty high measures of spending too little, not at the high end, but, water infrastructure, 44%.
Which that's one of those where the elites are really trying to push that to get that message out right now because they want to spend money on water.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting, the ongoing struggle of the last few sessions as as you've seen these ideological fights inside the Republican Party that is so dominant in the state. The fights between Republicans and Democrats and how that is all coming to a head in this as we go into, an election year in 2026. Very interesting to me. All right, so let's go before we run out of time. I want to do our usual lightning round. Whatever we've done, what we talked about, what else sticks out that you want to flag while we have a few minutes? Darren?
Well, we had there's one for you and one for us approach to polling sometimes, with one for you being
particularly in December.
Our public, our audience, our clientele being the you, but the one for us was a series of questions, fave, unfave ratings on Texans. Bunch of homegrown Texans. So we should, just so that we don't get I don't get a bunch of crappy emails. Some Texan-born, some are transplants, some like Joe Rogan.
They've got an association,
right?
strong
association by choice.
Right.
I moved here too.
Yeah,
and so did you.
That's right. So, and this is everywhere from pop internet. So Willie Nelson is on the list. Selena Gomez, Beyonce, who has appropriately high, favorability ratings. But I was struck as a sports fan by our dear, Jerry Jones, owner of the late
the bum
great
steer of the year,
Dallas Cowboys. Yeah,
Texas Monthly's bum steer of the year.
Right. Almost all these people, have tremendous favorability ratings. Willie Nelson, Matthew McConaughey, Simone Biles, even Elon Musk is plus 24, fave, unfave. Nolan Ryan, who's also near and dear to my heart, 48 favorable, 3% unfavorable, and shame on the 3% who rate Nolan Ryan unfavorably. But on the negative side, I believe, Josh, correct me on this, I believe the only person in underwater on our entire list is Jerry Jones, who's 24 fave, 28 unfave, and including on the very unfavorable, 14 very unfavorable, only 6 very favorable. It's tough. It's tough. And perhaps part of the reason that, or at least kind of speaks to why the Bum Steer Award by Texas Monthly went to Jerry this year. Conversely, just on the sports side, Greg Popovich, still, plus 18 fave, unfave coach, legendary coach of the Spurs. So that caught my attention.
Legendary and politically outspoken.
That's right, politically outspoken. And 33% don't know who Greg Popovich is. I should not be surprised by this, but within Texas, I was a little surprised.
Well, the Jerry Jones, people with a fixed opinion of Jerry Jones is even lower.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And Jerry Jones was And Josh is laughing at me. This I keep, and Jerry Jones made a cameo on Landman.
I know, and which I heard was very good. But yeah,
well, I think reasonable people might disagree about that.
Okay,
he was, I'll
I
tell you
heard
this.
he was acting chops.
He was better than I thought, but I'll put it this way: the scripting of his scene was on a line with the rest of that show.
All right, I got you. Okay.
Josh, how about you?
I'll
Little
try-
cultural criticism.
I was going to say that's another pod.
Sorry.
We could talk about those alone. But anyway, yeah, I think in a continued effort to uncover the evolving sort of state of, relevant abortion attitudes here in Texas, we did a little bit of a survey experiment where we presented half of our subjects with one version of a question and half of our respondents with another version of the question. So therefore, we know that the difference is just related to the question wording. And so what we asked was, in one question, do you believe, yes or no, that human life begins at conception? And then in the other version of the question, we asked whether constitutional rights and protections begin at conception. The idea here is to get to this, sort of suss out this, whether there's a difference that people want to make between when human life starts versus when we're going to start, sort of extending rights to that human life. So what we found was 56% of Texans said, yes, human life begins at conception. That drops to 39%, so 17-point drop when we switch that to constitutional rights and protections. Among Democrats, you see an 11-point drop, which is not surprising that it's less because they started at a lower baseline. 39% said, yes, human life begins at conception. 28% said the same thing for constitutional rights and protections. For Republicans, the drop was 18 points from 71% who said human life begins at conception compared to 53% who said that constitutional rights and protections begin at conception. Where most of that movement went was to the don't know. So the don't know doubled from 16% among Republicans to 30%. The biggest movement was among independents. Shocker. 47% said human life begins at conception. Only 19% said that constitutional rights begin at conception. That was a 28-point drop. So that's something we're going to, mess around with, I think.
Well, I was really glad we split that sample on that because we've talked about how to ask that question a lot internally. And Josh and I, as we were, doing that draft, kind of kicking it around, it's kind of like, let's just find out. It's again, this was kind of a split between one for everybody else, but also one for us. The December poll is where we're more likely to kind of do things like this. And
just to put just the slightest bit of interpretation on it. I mean, I think what you got to understand here is that, to the extent that there is a majority of Texans who say, yes, human life begins at conception when embryo is created, when sperm hits egg, that is when human life begins. But it's important to note, and what this sort of uncovers is that doesn't equal this is a fully formed person who gets legal rights and all that stuff in everybody's mind.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the next step with some of this stuff that we're trying to just, get a little baseline sense
There's
of.
really a lot to think about.
This speaks to our kind of larger project on abortion, which is, teasing or sussing out the complexity of circumstance and timing. And I actually like this project in the sense that, the American public is trying, Texas public is trying to do the best they can on these issues with competing interests.
Yeah.
And I think that's reasonable and, worth documenting and kind of gauging how compelling some circumstances or timing issues are compared to others is that's something that we can contribute to the conversation if we can kind of give information on that.
All right, for myself, I want to go back. I'm going to give myself again point of privilege and take two sort of. I want to piggyback on Darren's point about Elon Musk, and we all kind of wanted to talk about.
Yeah,
the public figure ratings.
We make Josh do issues.
We've been talking about the public doing something like this for
a
quite
long
a while,
time, yeah.
And we finally look, the figures on that list, we got a lot of good variance on that list. The original motivation, not surprising, is for us, but is more within the mission, which, I've been long interested in. A few years ago, people were talking about Matthew McConaughey running for governor. And now Elon Musk has now become the kind of edge case that really pushed us into finally doing it, to my mind, in a way. And it was interesting to me, if you look at those internals on Elon Musk, just how quickly, and it's not totally understandable, but just how quickly the partisan structure has formed in the attitude towards him. I mean, the Republican, favorable ratings are like 80% or something, I think, or right in that neighborhood. Democrats much lower. And it really reminds me to go back to our pop culture podcast today. And this is something you pointed out to me before I watched the documentary, Josh, and that is the scene in the Taylor Swift documentary in which she's talking about endorsing against Martha Blackburn. And you could see her financial advisors, I think including her dad, are sitting there going, Well, you can do what you want,
Her
but
lawyer-
you know,
her lawyer
you're
and her
kind of going to
manager.
alienate half your audience no matter what you do. And that happened so fast with Elon Musk. Now, I think there was probably already some leaning going that, but his closeness to Trump, he's cratered among Democrats, right, in an interesting way. The other thing is actually something you flagged earlier in the podcast, but, you know, we did our institutional organizational ratings, where we asked people, and I was interested in the 4 that were net negative. In other words, a lot of the institutions, and again, this December poll, were edged into net, stayed in net favorable territory, some much more than others. But the 4 that were net negative, the criminal justice system, the federal government, the news media, and major corporations based on outside the United States. And to me, that raises questions we won't be able to plumb here about this. Like, what is going on with this anti-institutional impulse? Where does it really cohere? What's going to happen with the Doge thing, or whatever we're supposed to call that, Doge? That is the fundamental effort to kind of reduce the size of the federal government, but also then the fundamental changes in the media environment, which we've not really talked about when the 3 of us have been together. But when you look at the way the media environment shaped this election, which is also one of the things that kind of did run underneath the surface of our public figure thing by asking about Joe Rogan, including Joe Rogan on that list. But if you're following the media business right now, this election was a watershed that we paid a lot of attention to, the social media, the podcast election and all of that. But, the news media, the structure of the news media is completely changed and is not going back. And I think in some ways, that's such a mundane observation. We've all watched cable. But I mean, the cable industry is right now, the companies that own the major cable outlets are having a fire sale. I mean, they're basically divesting themselves, and that market is kind of done. And that outlet is really pretty done. And I think the negative ratings of the news media really made me think about the degree to which, people are just getting their political information in very different ways than when we started doing this. Really, all 3 of us, let alone the older ones among us.
I think that really dovetails with what Darren was talking about earlier and what we were talking about here about, thinking about handicapping the Trump administration is going to be to a large extent about how people feel about the economy. I mean, just kind of not to be too simple, but to the extent that what was the last election about? It's kind of about the economy. I mean, that's what everybody kept telling us.
Yeah.
We can make it more complicated, but that was what it was for a lot of people. And it does make me wonder, okay, the economy, technically, there are numbers that we can all look to, but if we're all getting information, this totally, how is this going to shape out?
Right, because look, when you're in the supermarket, to go back to earlier conversation, picking up a dozen eggs and going, man, prices, bite inflation, that used to be you competed with what you were hearing when, more or less you went home and listened to the monocultural media outlets like your 5 o'clock local news, the 6 o'clock national news. Now, I don't know there's a million other things competing with that. And, the lack of trust in the news media, when we put it that way, such as it previously existed, is going to be a huge factor in that. Trump has proven adept at that, but at managing that and part of that, but
we need to let Darren go. But I was going to say, but part of that also is the fact that the monolith, the opposite of the monolith is not just that it's fractured, but that it's served up. So I'm finding you because you are a Republican voter when I'm trying to message you on this. I'm trying to get you to this source of information. I'm finding Democratic voters. I'm finding, and that's the thing about it that's really.
And yet, a really interesting thing. I mean, you mentioned the fires in L.A., Darren, and I was listening to one of the media podcasts at Puck the other day. I mean, these couple of guys on the podcast were based in L.A., and just also a discussion of. Was part of the critique of how city government communicated, but they're also saying, but the numbers of the viewership of the local newscast just skyrocketed.
Yep. Yeah.
So when everything went to kind of hell, people went, well, I'm going to turn on, KTLA or Eyewitness News. Or
we actually did. We checked in, but real quickly, just a couple of scattered observations. Local news is the exception to the media You know,
And
to
it's
the
local
general
TV news.
Yeah.
to the general storyline about the decline of legacy or mainstream. That's and politicians know that. You talk to the Abbott people, you talk to people at the national level. They understand that. They still care about
Local media
what's
market
going
hits.
on in Lubbock and what's going on in Laredo and et cetera. The second observation would be the exception to the legacy media is irrelevant is a big exception in 2024, and that is chasing Joe Biden out of the race.
Yeah.
The formation of a consensus in these legacy media, especially cable carriers, MSNBC, CNN, et cetera, that debate was disastrous. And the conversation that flowed from that on social media and elsewhere. We always have this question about is the tail wagging the dog or a question of causality, what's driving what. We saw that in real time. I was watching Democratic-leaning cable stations immediately, and they weren't responding to social media. They were saying this
the thing
was
itself.
Yeah,
They were looking at the eggs.
So it's interesting. It's
Right.
part of this, and I agree with the larger narrative about the just irrelevance in many ways of the legacy media in modern politics. But boy, that's a big outlier.
Yeah, they're dying, but they're not dead. And
right. And who if they're gone, would that have happened? And we should probably. But boy, the push and the effect on the left, the counterfactual would be if they had hung in there and said, it wasn't that bad. He had an off night. He was jet lagged. But boy, nobody did that. And if they had, would Democrats have hung with, interesting.
Well, there's an interesting conversation about the object itself and just how much space there was for reinterpretation.
Well, that's the third and final point, which is at what point does, there are people who would argue that, well, what this means is that there is no reality beyond a partisan reality. I beg to differ on that. You look at inflation. You look at Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. You look at the wildfires in Los Angeles. And, who are you going to believe? Who are you going to believe, us or your lying eyes? I think your lying eyes is still a powerful thing.
Yeah.
And so while I agree with every point that we've been making and we'll probably co-author with you guys at some point on these observations, the exceptions or the complications are really interesting.
They tell us something.
They do, absolutely.
They do. Guys, thanks. Super fun, as always. Maybe even a little bit more today. I don't know. Maybe because I haven't seen Darren in a
Freed
while.
up from the election.
The election.
We're all in good moods.
Yeah, So thank you guys for being here. Thanks very much to our excellent crew here in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to all of you for listening. Remember, we'll if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, we did go through a lot of data today. We'll post links to data on our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu, and we'll put some direct links in the post for the podcast in our blog section so you can go find stuff. So, and with that, thanks again, and we'll be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.